My future and ISKCON's future turned black. My future was ISKCON, and yet, as I sat there listening to Ramesvar explain all this, I saw ISKCON's future, which was also my own future, turn completely black before me. Now that Srila Prabhupada had departed, these men were now our leaders. They were now the sole leaders of the ISKCON mission. Yet here, just a little over 1 week after Srila Prabhupada departed, I now learned that these great leaders had just lied to us using Prabhupada's name. They had just taken deliberate and offensive actions to prevent Srila Prabhupada's last personal loving request from being fulfilled. They had offended us, but far worse, they had offended Srila Prabhupada. What future is there when your leaders lie to you and cheat their own spiritual master? I no longer saw them as leaders, but in my heart, I knew they were liars. What sort of future is there for Prabhupada's mission with lying so-called leaders like this? Liars who were convinced that it was righteous of them to have prevented Srila Prabhupada's dying personal request from being fulfilled. What is that? They felt it was noble for them to have offended Prabhupada. And I could see at that point, but all I could see at that point was a very black future for ISKCON. Naturally, I sat there wondering, what other lies have they told us? What other things had Srila Prabhupada requested that these men had told us just the opposite? How many other times they had deliberately and knowingly offended Srila Prabhupada? How many more lies will they tell us in the future? How can we trust or respect such so-called leaders like this? These were the thoughts that were racing through my mind as I sat there across from Ramesvar, as he was practically boastfully telling me what he and the other leading GBC men had done. These questions were natural. Anyone else in my position, on hearing what I had just heard, would have the same thoughts. At that time, I wasn't aware of any other details, and it wasn't until 2011, 34 years later, after I was doing research on this for this presentation, that I found additional and confirming information in the database about this event. Although that will be covered in the chronological timeline segment dealing with this period of time, let me briefly say that in the database, we find that Ramesvar came back to the U.S., that after Ramesvar came back to the U.S. and told devotees not to go to be with Srila Prabhupada, about a week later, Ramesvar got a message from India, came from Srila Prabhu, informing that Srila Prabhupada was feeling distressed and unhappy because he was not yet surrounded by his disciples. He had requested his disciples to come, and yet a week later, he wakes up and he sees only 3 devotees are with him in his room. And he was deeply saddened and expressed that he felt that his disciples were avoiding him. He expressed that his disciples must see him as poison and have chosen not to come to be with him. This message from Sari confirmed exactly what Bhardraj had told us back in November of 1977. I only became aware of this letter in the database in 2011. Sari expressed to Ramesvar his concerns that what they had done could wind up offending Srila Prabhupada in his last days with us. I will post copies of this evidence from the database in the chronological timeline section. Additionally, in the letter that Ramesvar wrote, which is in the database, where he quotes Sari, he also quoted another GBC man saying that if the senior devotees don't come to be with Srila Prabhupada, it was practically demoniac what they were doing. Yes, I agree. What these GBC men had done at that time was practically demoniac. It was demoniac. And this assessment regarding what they had done was made by one of the GBC men at that time. And yet I would like to point out that even that GBC man, who Ramesvar didn't give his name in the letter, states that the senior devotees must come to be with Srila Prabhupada, but that is not what Srila Prabhupada had requested. Prabhupada didn't request that just a handful of senior men come to be with him. Prabhupada had requested for all his disciples to come, each of us, no matter if we held the lowly position of the servant of the servant of the servant of the pure devotee, or we held a big managerial position. All of us had given and dedicated everything we had, our lives, to Srila Prabhupada and to Krishna. The most insignificant servant of Srila Prabhupada loves Srila Prabhupada with their full heart just as much as the devotees with big managerial positions. And Srila Prabhupada knew this, and he loved all his disciples with the same exact intensity of love and mercy. Like the story of Hanuman, who was carrying huge boulders to make the bridge to Lanka. And he told this tiny spider who was carrying a small grain of sand to get out of his way, because Hanuman considered he was serving Ram much more than that little spider. Ram chastised Hanuman and corrected him, telling him that the little spider was serving Ram to his fullest capacity, and therefore Ram appreciated his service the same as that of Hanuman's. About 10 years ago, I was speaking with a devotee who I can't recall his name right now. Just remembered it started with an H, I think, but I can't remember his name. He told me that in 1977, he was a temple president, and I think he said in Hawaii. He was also sannyasi at the time. He told me that in October of 1977, he was also making plans to go to India to be with Prabhupada when Ramesvar called him and told him the very same lies he had told us. This devotee told me that he was also personally disappointed, as I was on hearing this, and he instructed the devotees at his temple not to go also. He told me that it was several weeks after Srila Prabhupada left this world that he found out that the GBC men had lied to us. He told us he felt the same as I did, that he only saw darkness for ISKCON's future. At that point, he knew he could never serve under such GBC men anymore. Due to what they had done, he had lost all trust in them and all respect for the entire GBC. As a result, he told me he stepped down as temple president, he gave up his sannyas vows, and he wound up leaving ISKCON. 30 years after being away from ISKCON, when I spoke to him, he was finally again coming back to live and associate with devotees again. But this is how deeply these lies affected many devotees. It affected me for decades, as it did other devotees as well. These GBC men never considered how their actions and their lies would so deeply affect their God brothers and God sisters. But worse, many times worse, they didn't consider how their lies and actions would so deeply affect Srila Prabhupada and their relation with him. At the North American GBC meetings in 1990, Ravindra Sarup told a story that he had heard from Bhakta Charu Maharaj regarding Kirtanananda. I'm not sure the exact date that this took place, but I assume it was around a week or so before Ramesvar and Tamal Krsna and the other leading GBC members made their decision that Srila Prabhupada just didn't understand how foolish his request was and took such extraneous actions to thwart his personal request. But this story about Kirtanananda, it was his last exchange that he had had with Srila Prabhupada. In his last exchange, which again, keep in mind, occurred in and around the same time period as the incident we've been discussing, Srila Prabhupada angrily chastised Kirtanananda, telling him, "Don't ever think you know more than your spiritual master." The incident was in regard to Srila Prabhupada wanting to eat what his sister Pishima had cooked for him. Pishima, Prabhupada's sister, knew that Srila Prabhupada liked her cooking. It is known that she would cook with lots of mustard seeds and mustard oil. It takes a well-trained stomach to handle such cooking. At the time, Kirtanananda was acting as Srila Prabhupada's personal servant, and out of his concern for Srila Prabhupada, he thought it would be bad for Srila Prabhupada's health for him to eat such spicy hot food. Kirtanananda took action to try and keep Pishima from giving Srila Prabhupada the plate of food that she had cooked. Srila Prabhupada and Kirtanananda wound up arguing over this, which led Srila Prabhupada to angrily tell him, "Don't ever think you know more than your spiritual master." You can watch the short video of Ravinda Sarup retelling this story at the 1990 North American GBC meetings. There'll be a screen, so you just click on it. I don't see the screen yet, but it'll be there by magic. It'll just appear. Anyway, it wasn't just Kirtanananda who...
If I can just repeat one incident that happened, for example, with Kirtanananda Swami, according to Bhakti Charu Swami, this is the last exchange that happened between Kirtanananda and Srila Prabhupada. That Prabhupada's sister, we call Pishima, came to cook for him. And Kirtanananda was his secretary, his servant at the time, didn't want her to cook for him, thought it'd be bad for Srila Prabhupada, got in a series of arguments with Srila Prabhupada over it. And when she finally brought some prasadam and she had cooked for Srila Prabhupada, Kirtanananda tried to take it away. And Prabhupada became furious. Bhakti Charu Swami was in the room and said to Kirtanananda, "Don't ever think that you know more than the spiritual master." Kirtanananda turned around, left the room, packed his bags, and left Vrindavan. That was his last exchange with Srila Prabhupada. Don't you think that you ever know more than this spiritual master? So, Prabhupada obviously understood what was going on.
It wasn't just Kirtanananda who deserved such chastisement. That chastising instruction, which according to Ravinda Sarup was given in a very ferocious, angry mood, would apply 100 or even thousands of times more intensely for Ramesvar, Tamal Krsna, Satsvarup, and all the other GBC men who were involved with the incident regarding Srila Prabhupada's personal request, because of the much more severe, extreme, and comprehensive actions they had taken in order to sabotage Prabhupada's loving request. Kirtanananda only tried to keep a single plate of food from Srila Prabhupada. And in his attempt to do so, he didn't stoop to lying to every person, to every devotee all over the world by saying that Srila Prabhupada was saying just the opposite of what he actually said. Nor did his attempted action cause any hurt or offense to any other devotee, except Pishima and Srila Prabhupada. And in the end, Srila Prabhupada got and ate and enjoyed the food that his sister cooked for him. So all in all, what Kirtanananda did was totally pale in comparison to what these other GBC men did regarding this incident. What these other GBC men, with these other GBC men, they went to elaborate lengths to sabotage Prabhupada's personal request. Ramesvar flew halfway around the globe from India to America just so he could lie to all of us in person and spread that lie to all the temple presidents, spreading these lies all over the ISKCON world, telling us these lies in Srila Prabhupada's name. Telling lies in Krishna's temple directly before Lord Krishna is a grave and serious offense all by itself. By comparison, all Kirtanananda had done is just try to block Prabhupada's sister from giving Srila Prabhupada one plate of prasadam. And Srila Prabhupada was very angry with Kirtanananda because Prabhupada had told him that Pishima's cooking would not harm him. that it will help him. But Kirtanananda thought he knew better than Srila Prabhupada and tried to stop Bhishma from giving Prabhupada that one plate. But in the end, Prabhupada got the plate anyway. However, regarding these other GBC men, in the end, they were successful in sabotaging and thwarting Srila Prabhupada's request. At that time, they successfully achieved their goal to prevent us from hearing what Srila Prabhupada had actually requested. They successfully prevented us from going to be with Srila Prabhupada, to be by his side, when he had requested all of us to come. Well, they succeeded in carrying out their mission. Their real success was that they had succeeded to commit a most serious and horrendous offense against their guru and thousands of his disciples and followers. Their so-called success was actually a most horrible fall down and failure. While Srila Prabhupada had become, according to Bhakti Maharaj, or at least retold by Rabindra Swarup, because Bhakti was in the room when this took place. So according to them, Srila Prabhupada had become ferociously angry with Kirtanananda over his just trying to keep a single plate of food from him. I cannot fathom how many more times he was disturbed and upset toward these other GBC men for what they had done. For the purpose of historical record and to learn from these incidents, I will include a few stories as well in my assessment in an ancillary note. Srila Prabhupada just doesn't understand. The link is on the screen. You can view it now or tag it for viewing later. Another difference is that with Kirtanananda, he directly told Srila Prabhupada that he didn't want Srila Prabhupada to eat Bhishma's cooking because he thought it was too hot and spicy and would not be good for Srila Prabhupada's poor health. At least he expressed his concern directly with Srila Prabhupada. These other GBC men didn't even take their concerns to Srila Prabhupada. Ramesvar he took his concern to Tamal, and Tamal agreed without expressing that concern to Srila Prabhupada. Tamal only suggested they involve other GBC members. But at least Kirtanananda told Srila Prabhupada directly why he didn't want Srila Prabhupada to eat Bhishma's cooking. Ramesvar, Tamal, and the other GBC men, they didn't go to Srila Prabhupada and express their concerns that if so many devotees came to be with Srila Prabhupada, that it would lead to the total destruction of ISKCON. They didn't even give Srila Prabhupada the opportunity to address their faulty concerns. Rather, they simply acted on their faulty, completely wrong and thinking, and thus wound up committing horrible offenses, far more greater than those Kirtanananda had committed at that time. Don't ever think you know more than your spiritual master. It's a fair question to ask, why didn't they take their concerns to Srila Prabhupada first? In their defense, we can argue that the duty of the GBC members at that time was to manage the affairs of the society on Srila Prabhupada's behalf. On a daily basis, Ramesvar was making decisions for how the BBT should publish Prabhupada's books, how they should be distributed. As GBC these men made day-to-day managerial decisions regarding the temples and their zones and the members' personal issues. That was their duty, to make so many day-to-day managerial decisions on behalf of Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada had delegated those duties to the GBC men. And so it can be argued in Ramesvar's defense and the others that when they saw devotees who had important services leave their temples to come to Vrindavan to be with Srila Prabhupada, they were seeing this as a managerial issue. And therefore, They considered it was their duty to deal with it. Especially when Ramesvar saw the two Sankirtan devotees come. At that point, I would agree. It would have appeared to have been a managerial decision for him to make and the other GBC men to make. Should we go back and tell devotees not to come, especially the Sankirtan devotees? And they could have made that as a managerial decision on their own. But where all of that goes completely wrong is that this once Srila Prabhupada made that request himself that everyone come, then this was Srila Prabhupada's personal request. It was no longer a managerial issue for them to make on their own. Just as it was for Pishama making the plate of prasadam for Srila Prabhupada. If Pishama had just gone to Kirtanananda and Prabhupada didn't know about it, Kirtanananda still should have gone to Prabhupada because that was a little bit more personal issue. But my point is that once you know what Srila Prabhupada is saying, once he has said this cooking will not harm him, then one has to listen and obey the spiritual master and not think you know better. So once Prabhupada had made this request for everyone to come, then it was no longer a managerial issue for these GBC men to make on their own. This directly and personally involved Srila Prabhupada. This was his direct personal request. And at that point, these men's spiritual duty was to fulfill the request of their spiritual master. Ramesvar and the others who went along with this assumed that they knew better than Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada made the once when it was just the Sankirtan men involved, Ramesvar could have made it. He had already started to make that managerial decision, but once Prabhupada's personal request was there, it was no longer his managerial decision to make. Then it was Srila Prabhupada's personal request. But these men assumed that they knew more and that they were more intelligent than Srila Prabhupada because they thought Srila Prabhupada's request was so utterly foolish that it would lead to the complete and total destruction of ISKCON. That's far worse than thinking one spicy hot plate of Prabhupada's sister's cooking would harm Srila Prabhupada's health. Don't ever think you know more than your spiritual master.